Good morning, one and all. Welcome you all to the second International Legal and Policy Conference on the Future of Transport, Fall or Rise of the Transport Sector. As we are approaching the final leg of this conference, we have here with us a distinguished panelists who shall be deliberating on the topic, Transport Infrastructure, Policy Paralysis or Economic Paralysis. Our panelists for the session are Mr. Siddharth Kapoor, who is an infrastructure and airports expert, presently a board member at Noida International Airport, Dr. Konstantinos Kalkianis, who is aviation expert at KK Aviation Limited, and finally, moderator of the session, Mr. Moses George, who is Director Legal at Airports Economic Regulatory Authority. Welcome, sirs. I now request Mr. Moses George to preside over the session.
Thank you, Anaga, for the introduction, and welcome the panelists, Mr. Konstantinos and Siddharth Kapoor, to this panel discussion, as well as thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to chair this session. Without not giving much introduction to the subject, let me reflect only 2 points. Transport infrastructure is a major backbone of the transport industry, whether it is whichever mode of transport is used, especially aviation. And world over, the more aviation sector infrastructure is developing, and its ownership also changing from government sector to private sector. We are seeing different changes and development of various airports all over the world, in India also, as well as in Europe and Middle East, everywhere. So in this context, in the background of COVID-19 and the pandemic, we are going to discuss about this topic, transport infrastructure, policy paralysis or economic paralysis. We are having 2 eminent panelists. Without wasting time, I invite Dr. Konstantinos to start his presentation. Mr. Konstantinos, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Moses. Thank you for the invitation to this great conference. So let's start about the question of the conference, whether it's a policy or economic paralysis. And this is a very good question. I mean, airport infrastructure have a very important financial characteristics. The airport industry is a high capex, so capital expenditure, therefore it requires heavy funding for developing new airports, but also expanding new airports, expanding existing airports, and also high OPEX. It's a sector that has high operational expenditures. So in one way, the main way, you require funding. So over the years, I mean, initially, the majority of the airports were publicly owned and operated. And because of the high funding requirements, over the year, we look at different models. We moved from publicly owned and operated airport to corporatized airport, which is actually publicly owned, but operated with private sector incentives. And during the recent years, we have the airport privatization trend for most countries in the world. Of course, we have some notable exceptions, and we have the US that the perceptions of airports is completely different than the rest of the world. By government, by policymakers, airports are seen as public infrastructure and are handed to airlines at different terminals to be operated. So regarding the economic requirements, thanks to the free economy, we have found ways in order to fund airports. And also over the years, airports have aviation professionals and experts have realized the opportunities, the non-aeronautical, the commercial opportunities that airports have. And therefore, we have found a way to fund airports. The question about economic paralysis is still quite recent, because what happens now, because of COVID, there are a lot of concerns what will happen with regional airports. Airports that are located in not so popular destinations, city destinations, or not as cities that have that are business centers, and therefore predominantly cater for leisure traffic, and therefore there are concerns that these airports will face an issue regarding funding over the years. Regarding the policy requirement for airports, because airports have very, very important, as we see, there are social and economic impact effects of airports. There are even countries that their entire economy is based on airports. I'm quite active in the Gulf region, and what has happened, I mean, the majority of the countries there, as you know, their main driver of their economies is oil. But what happens, these countries have developed strategic plans in order their economies to become independent from oil over the recent years. So I'm heavily involved in a few of them, and the one that I started was in Abu Dhabi. But what they have done, according to their strategic plan, they have identified 7 different industries in order to invest money, and by 2030, their economy to be independent from oil. So one of these industries is aviation, but this is not the, I mean, aviation is also the foundation for tourism, which is the second most important industry according to the strategic plan. And we have seen what Dubai's economies has been transformed thanks to aviation, that currently more than 20% of the jobs in Dubai are in the aviation sector. So this question about the conference is very important, but we have seen that the policymakers are working in order to increase the aviation sector. We've seen, I mean, the European Union, they have some projects even to fund infrastructure, airport infrastructure, and other transportation infrastructure outside the EU. For example, I'm currently involved in a project in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there is the 10T policy. What they do, they invest in developing the infrastructure of Bosnia and other Western Balkan countries in order also to develop their economy and become more integrated with the European Union, both in terms of socially, but also in terms of economic importance. So the other important question here is, how did COVID change the airport sector? I mean, that's something that we see we are currently facing, the biggest crisis that the aviation sector has ever faced so far. And we have seen that experts have changed their view of what will be the temporary effect of this crisis. And you see, at the beginning of the crisis, 2 years ago, there were a lot of aviation professionals that were giving interviews, and they were saying that, you know, the aviation sector will change forever. It will never be the same. It will take decades to change. And I remember I gave an interview just at the beginning of the crisis, and that I've emphasized that the aviation sector has a strong capability in bouncing back. And, you know, my view was not very popular at the time, but as we have seen 2 years after the crisis, nearly 2 years after the COVID crisis, the beginning of the COVID crisis, that a lot of the international aviation organizations are coming up with a much more optimistic view regarding the aviation recovery. So, for example, Eurocontrol says that air traffic will reach the 2019 levels by the end of 2023 or the end of 2024. So we can see this view is much more positive than the majority of aviation professionals' view at the beginning of the crisis. So here we look, more or less, the recovery will take place in 2 or 3 years, according to most international organizations and according to the majority of the experts. So the question here is, what will happen with the infrastructure? Before the crisis, we have a lot of airports that were facing capacity issues, predominantly in Europe. Also that you have a lot, the great majority of the heavily congested airports. So there was a time now, that's the first time, I mean, during the COVID, because of the drop of the traffic, that we are not facing about the same issue. So we need to identify whether the infrastructure, whether airport capacity will be required in the same airports, in the same regions, or the COVID crisis will change the focus of the infrastructure development, of the airport infrastructure development. And this is one important question. There are two views. I mean, here it's not just aviation, it's tourism professionals, that you have some tourism professionals that claim that what will happen now, the crisis will increase demand for not so popular destinations. Okay, rather than international visitors to visit Paris, the #1 destination in the world, they may prefer to go in Bordeaux or somewhere in the French region. They want to be a bit less crowded, because one thing that it will be for sure that it will stay, its passengers will be more health conscious, because there's one thing is safety and health safety, and the other issue is health safety perception. So a lot of experts agree that something that will stay during the post-COVID era is that passengers will be more concerned regarding health issues, because the COVID crisis will be over, but what will happen if we have a new pandemic in the year? And one other thing regarding the process is that also a lot of policy makers, the majority of the policy makers agree that it will happen, that we will have an additional process in the airports. We will have health screening, and one way or another, we will come up with health certificates that will be part of the entire airport processing and the travel experience. So, I mean, in a nutshell, this is regarding my views. I mean, how am I doing regarding time? Is it fine, or?
You can take a few more minutes, correct, Sagar?
Okay, so regarding we've seen about the social and economic importance of airports. And we see that there are direct, indirect, which is people that are working at the airport or in downstream industry supporting the on-site employment at the airport. There are induced employment, which is actually employment generated by the spending from the direct and indirect employees at airports. So the money that they spend for renting apartments, that they go to the restaurants, to the supermarket, and also catalytic, which is actually the general economic benefits because of the presence of the airport, like tourism, trade, business connectivity, etc. So what is expected to do, what happens over the years, at the beginning of 2000, for every 1 million annual passengers, we had around 1,200 direct and indirect jobs for every 1 million annual traffic. At 2019, for 1 million annual passengers, we had 850 direct and indirect jobs. So if you see, the ratio of direct and indirect employment to annual traffic has decreased. But this does not mean that the total number of jobs has decreased, because as a rule of thumb, every 15 years, global air traffic doubles. So the number of jobs, direct and indirect jobs in the aviation sector has increased, but they have become more productive. And there are two reasons for that. One is new technologies and airport digitalization, but also better educated, better trained workforce that are more efficient. So this trend is also something, because COVID has resulted in a lot of of a faster implementation of new technologies. We can see a lot of self-service airport terminals. So what I'm expecting to see over the years is again this ratio to decrease at lower levels, but again the number of jobs to continue to grow. I mean, in a nutshell, that was a bit my view of the situation and how COVID has impacted the aviation sector and airport infrastructure.
Thank you. Thank you, Konstantinos. Thank you for throwing some light on the economic as well as policy aspects of the airports infrastructure on the basis of the COVID impact. We'll come to the questions later. Now, I invite Siddharth Kapoor to present his session talk. Over to Mr. Siddharth Kapoor.
Thank you, Moses, and thank you for inviting me for this conference. Am I audible? So I don't have a presentation to give at the start, but let me make a few opening remarks, especially on the transportation sector and more specifically on the airports. I think Konstantinos has given an excellent overview of various international angles to the aviation sector, and also how COVID has impacted this sector and what is the immediate future going ahead. Of course, the topic is very wide when we talk about the transportation infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure would cover not just aviation, airports, airlines, but also railways, roadways, shipping, ports, logistics, waterways. And all these are, I think, attracting a great deal of focus over the past few years in terms of development and more specifically on privatization of this infrastructure. And most of them have been severely affected on account of COVID. And there are different policy initiatives of the government under different sectors. And I also want to emphasize that each of this sector is fairly unique. Although we try to bring everything under the transportation infrastructure framework, but the business models of each are quite distinct and diverse. The airport business model, I think, is one of the most complex business models in the infrastructure space. Leave aside the transport infrastructure space. You have three clear revenue streams, which are aeronautical revenues, which are typically regulated. You have non-aeronautical revenues, which are large in number. It can cover things like food and beverage, advertising, car park, duty-free retail, duty-paid retail, airport lounges, land and space, hotels, foreign exchange, porter service, ATMs, and many of them are subsectors of their own right, having different business models, but they need to be integrated into the airport business model. And the third element of revenue, which is gaining significant attention and is also a big contributor to the airport business model, is that of the real estate. Typically in all airport privatizations and also the airports which are owned by the public sector, there is a large amount of real estate available in the airport land bank for development for retail as well as commercial purposes, and that can become a very significant driver of growth, not just for the aviation sector but for the entire economy in that region. Typically, aviation sector had been fairly muted till about 2009-10. But post that, once the privatization of airports took place and the aviation and airline sector also, brought competition by a number of airlines in the private sector, we have seen that between 2009 and I would say just pre-COVID 2019, the growth has been almost 12% CAGR over, almost 11, 12 years. The more recent growth between 2015 and 2019 has been significantly higher at about 15, 16%. Of course, the growth has got impacted due to COVID, but this is very clearly an aberration. And I think the contributors for this growth has been multifold in India. One, of course, has been that the privatization of airports has brought significant infrastructure available to allow unconstrained growth for airlines. There has been greater competition in the airline sector, which has brought down ticket prices. One of the biggest, I think, turning points has been that of price parity of the airline tickets with that of railways. Now, and for many, many years now, almost 5, 6 years now, the average ticket price of a flight is now very close to that of a second AC railway ticket. And that, I think, has been a very significant change, which has given a fillip to the aviation sector in India. The government, of course, has been fairly conducive in terms of looking at privatization in Indian airport space. In India, we have a history of almost 20 years of privatization. And I can, fairly well argue that this has been globally the most successful airport privatization stories. Indian airports today are amongst the, the best airports in the world in ASQ rankings. Private airports handle almost 2/3 of the Indian passenger traffic. The private airport operators have invested almost INR 350 billion, in private airports in the past. And almost double this amount is now being invested over the next 5 to 7 years in privatized airports. The PPP model also has, evolved significantly. We started off with the privatization based on percentage revenue shares, which has now evolved into a model where the government is looking at payments by the airport operator on a per passenger basis. There have been amendments to the ERA framework also. In 2016, the government came out with a, for the first time came out with a very, very conducive aviation policy, which covered probably all the sectors and subsectors of the aviation business. And as part of that policy, they laid to rest, I think, one of the biggest issues that was plaguing the airport sector was about what kind of till is to be adopted for regulation. And the 2016 policy clearly laid out that it has to be based on a shared hybrid till. And that laid to rest, significant amount of litigations as well as disputes in the regulatory framework. And so over a period of almost 10 years, the regulatory framework has become more predictable and it has become more business oriented. There are, still wrinkles which are there, which are pending, but I think most of the bigger gated items have been resolved, and airports are, the privatization story has become much more stronger and robust. So all this, the changes, the regulatory changes, the privatization has brought about significant benefits. It has added very significantly to the government, the government's kitty and revenue. Delhi and Bombay Airport, just two, have contributed almost 30,000 crores, which is almost $300 billion INR to the government kitty over the last 10 years. It has attracted, private capital for capex investment. It has provided infrastructure for unconstrained growth. The passenger experience has been one of the biggest beneficiaries. We have seen airports becoming much more usable, much more passenger friendly, much more airline friendly, and the infrastructure has become much more attractive and more in line with many of the best airports in the world. And it is, easy to say now that, the best airports in the world based on ACI rankings or any other rankings are now in India. All the airport operators have gained significantly in terms of equity returns. There has not been a single default to the lenders. It has been a very, very strong employment generator. Every $1 spent in the aviation sector has brought about multiple growth in employment generation. Konstantinos talked about the direct, indirect, and induced benefits. And for example, just one airport, Delhi airport, has contributed in terms of direct, indirect, and induced employment of almost 1.3 lakh employees. Just one single airport, and you can imagine what a entire aviation sector has been. The GDP contributor has been very, very significantly. Now, what is the current status? I think as far as the aviation and airport sector is concerned, and also maybe just touch upon a little bit upon what the transportation sector we are talking about. As I mentioned, the regulatory variability in airports has reduced considerably over the last 10 years. The COVID situation, of course, has impacted airlines and airports very, very severely. But we are seeing, after a very, very strong vaccination drive and a significant gap in travel by both the business as well as leisure travelers, that there has been a strong comeback of domestic traffic specifically. And how far this goes, I think it is still debatable, because I think there could be many reasons why there has been a sudden spurt. It could be because passengers are suddenly now the visiting friends and family traffic has suddenly grown. There has been a significant shift of traffic from railways to airlines because of health reasons. So there could be many reasons, but of course the business travel has got impacted, not just because of COVID, but because of the greater use of online platforms for meetings. The sector has been crying for support from the government, but quite understandably, given the government's finances, they have not been able to contribute significantly to the aviation sector in terms of cash benefits or in terms of grants, like similar to what has been done by various other countries. But I think in terms of government support, they have at least ensured that none of the airlines go bust. Putting price caps and floors on airline ticket prices has at least ensured that the weaker airlines remain in business. And I think that has been a good initiative, because we have seen in the past that whenever an airline goes bust, whether it was Kingfisher or whether it was Jet, there is a very significant increase in ticket prices, and it brings about a muting effect on aviation travel. So keeping the players intact, I think, has been one of the probable objectives of the government as far as the sector is concerned. We have seen that there has been a significant impact on the balance sheets of all the airlines and airport operators. Airlines have lost in India almost 20,000 crores, and airports have got impacted by almost 5,000 crores over the last 1.5 to 2 years. And most of this impact in the cash has been met by debt and payables of various players. Either they have taken more debt or they have not paid to the suppliers. So in most cases, the balance sheets have got impacted. One good thing has been the accelerated adoption of technology, innovation, and cost optimization. And we can talk about that a little more in detail a little later. As I said, there has been a sharp rebound of traffic due to VFF travel, leisure travel, and maybe a little bit also of the nascent business travel. The government, of course, has brought about greater focus on privatization, and airports. As I said, that the privatization story is very robust in India. It is very strong. There have been successes all around, with all the stakeholders not having significant complaints and benefiting in many ways. But the the monetization pipeline has a fair degree of privatization initiatives on the transportation infrastructure. The government is targeting 25 airports to be privatized, almost 26,000 kilometers of roads, 400 railway stations, 90 trains, and almost 31, 31 ports. Now, a lot of the success, as I mentioned, the airport privatization, the model has been well set. The road privatization, the model has been well set. But when we talk about some of these other sectors which are nascent and they don't have parallels in the past, I think there will be a very strong case for ensuring a robust business model as well as a regulatory framework to ensure the success of the privatization story in some of these other transportation infrastructure sectors. For example, the government tried to privatize railways, railway trains in the recent past, which was not successful, and it is back on the drawing board with them to look at the business model again. There were concerns and there were hardly any response. Similarly, the railway station privatization, there is still a need to bring about clarity on what is going to be the user charges and how they will be determined, and what is the the full large scale business model for the privatization and all this. But nevertheless, I think these are issues which the government has grappled in the past. As I said, there can be delays in India, but there cannot be denial. And over a period of time, I think we head towards a scenario where the business models are adopted, they are fine-tuned, and they are ultimately, developed, keeping in mind and bring about success in the sector, which we have seen as in the airport sector. I will probably pause here and hand back to you, Moses, and we can discuss in more detail some of the other issues, what are concerning the airport sector, aviation sector, as well as some of the issues on the transportation side.
Thank you, Sir Kapoor, for giving a detailed view about the sector and its challenges, as well as the development happening in the last few decades itself, and to the in connection with the COVID situation also. And now I think we'll go with some general questions to the panelist. Actually, the panelist has covered what does in 2022 holds for in terms of opportunities and challenges, as well as the impact of pandemic as of now, what we can see. But the one fundamental question would be whether are we ready with infrastructure, the required infrastructure in terms of the requirement for cities as well as the rural sector, considering the COVID impact. Once the COVID impact is over and the recovery is more, whether we are ready with the required infrastructure. Mr. Konstantinos, you can start as well. Then thereafter, Siddharth Kapoor sir can respond to this question. Over to Konstantinos.
Thank you for the great question. I mean, what happens here? The airports that were heavily congested, for example, like Heathrow, Munich, Heathrow has been trying to get the third runway more than 20 years now. So it is considered as the soap opera of the airport sector, because it's one of the most heavily congested airports, and one that you have the highest demand for airlines operating there. And it's not surprisingly that Oman Air paid $75 million to Air France and KLM in order to get access to their slot at Heathrow. So what happens here? Because as it always happens in the aviation sector, global air traffic is expected to return at the pre-COVID levels, and also continue the growth trend of where it used to be. So what happens here? The airports that are heavily congested still need to expand. You still need to provide more capacity. So the question there, and that was a very good point from Siddharth regarding business travel. I mean, what happens there are some views that because of Zoom, because of Teams, and because of these platforms, that a lot of the business travel will be replaced. That was also the concerns many years ago with Skype. So what has happened in reality was Skype did not affect it negatively business traffic, but in a way it enhanced the possibility of having international virtual offices. So it acted as a facilitator of growth. And that's also something that I would like also to emphasize, that there are some concerns that these online platforms will affect business traffic, and therefore you will not have the same growth rate as before. But on the other hand, this could also act as a facilitator of this growth. So regarding the infrastructure, I think my view is that the airports that were heavily congested before COVID, they will still require capacity expansion. But I think the focus should also be in terms of the supply, because one important concern was that when air traffic demand will return to the pre-COVID levels, that because of the early retirement of aircraft and because the aircraft manufacturers have downscaled their productions, there will not be sufficient aircraft and there will not be sufficient pilots in order to cater for this demand. So I think in the medium term, we should also focus in terms of supply and making sure that we have the aircraft required in order to cater for this demand. And of course, you know, as I said, the airports that were required capacity before the COVID will still require during the post-COVID era. Thank you.
Yeah, but in major airports, there may be a possibility that there was congestion. But other airports where there was no much congestion, then what about that? Those airports, how that in that sector, how it will go? What do you see?
So this is I mean, what happens here? We can see them on a lot of them will be on a case-by-case basis. So if you see the recovery rates vary considerably from country to country, but also from airport to airport within the same country. So if you see now the Gulf region, you see the recovery rates of Hamad International Airport and Dubai International Airport at much higher rate than, for example, Abu Dhabi International Airport. And Abu Dhabi International Airport has postponed the opening of the new terminal. So here, I mean, we need to look, and it's not a classification, in my view, a categorization regarding the size of the airport or the type of the airport, but we need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, from the previous panel, I think there was one question whether India could have a mega hub airport with a mega hub airline. I think it has the possibility in the future to have both a mega hub airline and a mega hub airport. But what happens here is the relationship between a hub airport and the transfer airline is symbiotic. Okay, that means that the existence and the growth of the one depends on the other. So that's also the case if you see the Qatar Airways. I mean, and that's why one of the reasons why both Qatar Airways and Hamad International Airport won the Skytrax Best Airline and Best Airport Awards in 2021, because as a strategy, Qatar Airways, among the largest airlines, they reduced their destinations served, the number of reductions were the lowest in compared to the other mega hub carriers. So in addition to the very high quality of service offered at the airport and at the airline, I think that was also important in terms of the recovery status of the airline. Whereas if you compare it with Etihad airlines that were, also the Abu Dhabi had more strict travel restrictions before. They are quite behind in terms of the recovery. So in order to answer in a nutshell your question, I think we need to look at it on a case-by-case basis, but definitely some regional airports will end up with underused capacity, but some others will require capacity expansion.
Yeah, so that covers about on this point, especially from the Indian perspective, as well as what is happening, what is expected to happen in the Indian scenario. Please throw some light.
Yeah. So I think, the question is very, very apt, and infrastructure development cannot happen in a matter of, a few years. The planning needs to take place very much in advance. And especially if we are talking about airports, the characteristic of airports is that the way the current business model of airlines is that it needs a lot of land. You need a large amount of runway space. And till that time that the business model is disrupted and we have, I don't know when in future, maybe vertical takeoff aircrafts, which are equally efficient in terms of speed and size, this business model is there to stay. So, cities develop around airports. And naturally, over a period of time, if there is a airport for a city, if you take an airport like Bombay or Delhi, the cities have overgrown and overrun that infrastructure, and there is no room for growth. Therefore, if the government has to look at the growth of the aviation sector, I think this is one of the biggest concerns that can affect, the passenger and the aviation sector in India, is availability of land. We are talking about now second airports in Mumbai. We are talking about second airport in Delhi. We are talking about second airports coming up in other cities also now. But when we look at our long-term planning for an airport, for example, in Chennai, we have for many years talked about a second airport because the existing airport will not be able to, have another runway. Similarly, Pune, which is a Air Force airport, you need a robust airport. Goa needed a robust airport. They planned for another airport, on the other side of the state, and they planned for it, and now it is coming up. So state governments don't have money for land acquisitions. I really, my hats off goes to the UP government, the way they went about land acquisition for the second airport of Delhi, and the way it was done in a matter of time, and the way the funds were allocated for it. But if we have to think, let's say 20 years ahead, that what is going to be, where will an airport, let's say catering to a Mumbai region or a Delhi region today has, almost 25-30 million population. And in 20 years, it may be 50 million population, not only because of the growth in population, but because of influx of people into the, urban areas. And what is our plan for, catering to the airport and aviation needs for that region? So the land acquisition process has to start very much in advance. It has to start probably 15-20 years in advance. You may need to acquire land, keep it, and retain it and develop it at the right time, because it will become prohibitively expensive. It may not be even available, in 20 years' time. So I think that is one point which I think is very critical when long-term planning for infrastructure is there. The second is the multimodal connectivity as far as infrastructure is concerned. We are looking at the airport coming up in Jewar, but there needs to be metro connectivity. There needs to be, the road connectivity is excellent, but there needs to be metro connectivity to make it economical for a passenger to travel, let's say to a Jewar airport. We need multimodal connectivity between Jewar airport and Delhi airport to see that if how can people actually come to one airport, like in London, they come to Gatwick and go to Heathrow. So how can that be facilitated and developed? So I think the multimodal connectivity is another very critical area. And how can the airports be linked to metro stations, railway stations, roadways, busways? All that planning needs to be part of the entire infrastructure exercise. The other critical issue is the environment issue. Things are becoming more and more critical as far as ESG is concerned. Today, it is becoming extremely difficult to even raise money because lenders and investors are looking at the ESG issues in infrastructure. And renewable power and green power and the greening of the infrastructure is one of the critical areas. So I think this is another very critical issue as far as infrastructure is concerned. So the limited point, therefore, which I wanted to make was that it needs long-term planning. It does not need planning for the next 5 years. It needs planning for the next 20 years. And that planning has to be focused upon where the infrastructure will be developed, what is the land available for it, and what will be the multimodal connectivity for it.
Yeah, that's correct. We'll start from the last point you have touched upon, multimodal connectivity. Yeah, this may be relatively easy for the new airports, but the old airports, it will be a bit more difficult. What is your take on that thing, Mr. Konstantinos, specifically? And so the sports are on Indian context. I mean, how compared to new airports, how the old airports are placed from this perspective as far as user experience is concerned, the multimodal transport system, how it will be facilitated and how it can be done. So, Konstantinos?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very good question. We've seen examples of entire countries, their economies being based in multimodal transportation of passengers, but also cargo. For example, the Netherlands, after the Second World War, what they have done, have developed Amsterdam as a large passenger hub airport, but also air cargo airport, and also Rotterdam being the largest port in terms of cargo tonnage in the Netherlands, and because of the country's location, was ideal as a logistical center. So what happens here? We have a lot of airports, a lot of countries, because as you said, it's multimodal transportation, and also it's the project that I told you. For example, when we look at 10T projects, they are looking at developing the entire infrastructure of the country and not one sector in isolation. So it's a very important one. I mean, modern airports have the opportunity to take multimodal transportation connection at the beginning of the development phase, so they have this advantage. Sorry, existing airports have the issue that the airport is already developed and you may not have the opportunity for a direct link. But what happens in these cases, when you have certain cases, you can still find ways for underground connection with metro to the airport. What has happened a lot is because also the European Union initiative, and as we have seen, I mean, high-speed rail is considered as a competing mode of transport to air transportation, but in certain cases, it also acts as a feeder. So if you see, for example, Lufthansa, they have a lot of, they are able to extend the catchment area of Frankfurt International Airport with the use of high-speed rail, and they sell the first leg on the high-speed rail with a Lufthansa flight number. So these are the importance of multimodal transportation. And coming back to your question, so I did a bit of overall introduction. New airports have the advantage that master planners can take this into consideration from the early stages and therefore provide a much better connectivity. Because, I mean, even existing airports can enhance their multimodal connectivity, but they need to work in respective steps, which is more costly and more time consuming.
Siddharth Kapoor, sir, you want to add something to that?
No, I think Konstantinos has covered the broader issues very well. Probably just from a Indian context, what I can say is that when one is planning a new and a greenfield infrastructure, it is much more easier, as Konstantinos also mentioned, and one can plan that. But in my view, many a times that planning is not there, or it is inadequate as far as the Indian planning framework is concerned. So that is something I think which a lot of focus has to be given, because airports are like one for a city. You can't have multiple airports. It's not like a railway station where you can have multiple railway stations within the same city. So careful planning has to be given to it, and careful planning has to be done as far as connectivity and multimodal transport is concerned. I also agree that as far as existing airports are concerned, it is fairly possible to have connectivity developed through underground mode, although it's more expensive. But that's the cost you have to pay as far as a existing infrastructure is concerned. For example, Delhi is well connected to the metro network. Mumbai is also well connected as far as the metro network is concerned, because these things are very, very critical, because economical connectivity, time saving connectivity, these are, I think, very, very important as far as airports are concerned. I think the bigger challenge is now coming up in the tier 2 cities. As we see in India, the tier 2 cities, the growth in air travel is growing faster than the main metros. For example, I was just reading just a day or two back that one of the fastest growing link between two cities, a pair between two cities, is that of Mumbai and Rajkot, which has grown pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. I think it has almost doubled. And the tier 2 cities, there is a greater affordability for air travel. There is a greater need and greater demand for quality infrastructure, and also along with it, there will be a greater need for better connectivity within the city to each airport. So like Nagpur is getting connected through a metro network. It is well already connected. You have Ahmedabad needs to get connected. There are many such cities where the traffic is now crossing 10 million, 15 million, and there is a greater need for metro connectivity as far as the infrastructure is concerned. So these things, I think the focus needs to be given to the local city planning, and I think this has to be a well coordinated effort between the airport authority, the private airport operator, wherever it is, the city authorities, as well as the state level authorities, to ensure that there is a cohesive plan, to ensure that there is a well developed infrastructure available, which is well connected and which seamlessly works with each other.
Thank you. Thank you. Sagar, can we take some questions from audience? Any questions? Sagar coming? Sagar coming?
Yeah. No, I'm here.
Yes, sir, we have a few questions.
You can you?
I can read it out for you, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is, what are the challenges in PPP funding as regards to infrastructure development? Will private entities find it risky to make PPP investment in aviation sector because of the delays in implementing the projects?
Yeah. Can we take this question? Siddharth Kapoor, sir, can you respond to this in a very short time? Okay. It's a big question. I can understand. That's what I'm telling. And you are subject matter expert also. So I am requesting you to put it in a very concise manner.
So yeah, no, it's a big question and it's a very wide question. But I think it's a very apt question. Aviation, as far as aviation sector is concerned, I have done fundings for airports across the world, and if the and this is true not just for the aviation or an airport sector, but also for any infrastructure asset or a project. If the regulatory framework, the concession framework, the legal framework is robust, funding is not a problem because automatically the business model will become robust. And we have seen, as far as India is concerned, the regulatory framework getting evolved over a period of time. And we had to look at different innovative means of financing for funding the infrastructure for whether it was Delhi or Hyderabad or any other asset like Goa or Vizag. The regulatory framework also played an important role. For example, the variability in cash flows of Delhi airport were so large because of sudden reduction in regulated charges by the regulator that to compensate that impact, we had to look at doing a bond issue internationally. And this was the first time a airport under PPP concession mode in India was looking at doing a bond issue internationally. So it took almost 2 years to develop the documentation framework, which could have been accepted by the international bond investors. But once it was accepted, it was a complete success, and it was followed, one by one by various other, airport operators. The business model, again, that is for, of course, a running airport. Even for, the Jewar airport, which is a greenfield airport, it has got its funding completely in place by the Indian banks because the banking sector today, I think, has looked at that asset more closely. And of course, going ahead, there can be other options available for doing, international or domestic bond issues. So again, I think funding is not a issue. What is more critical is to ensure that the PPP framework puts right the business model, and the regulatory framework acts as a facilitator to ensure fundability. And I think that is well in place as far as the Indian sector is concerned. And most of the other international players, whether it was funding for the Crete project, or it was funding for the Philippines project, or it was funding for Sabiha Gökçen in Turkey, the privatization framework and the regulated framework were fairly conducive from a funding standpoint, and that, I think, facilitated ease of funding. I think we didn't have any issues.
Thank you. We can take, I think, 1 or 2 questions more from the audience side. If you can read out.
So there's just one more question. The question is, in India, will UDAN scheme help in passengers to use the not so large airports?
So let me respond on that. I think the UDAN scheme has been a very, very significant policy initiative of the government. I don't have the figures right now, but at least what I remember is that it has been a great success as far as development of the aviation sector is concerned in India. As I said earlier in my comments, that there is a greater affordability and there is a greater propensity to travel by air in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And what was really missing was, number one, a decent airport in that city, which I think Airport Authority is now focusing on, because I think the focus of privatization is that they want to privatize, profit making and running airports, and use that cash for developing airports in tier 2 and tier 3 cities on a greenfield basis, where typically it takes time for an airport to ripen and develop to a level where it can become viable and it can become fundable. So smaller airports, the government will need to take initiative. The Airport Authority will need to take initiatives to develop the airport infrastructure in small cities. Two, what was other impact was the other missing link in this chain was the availability of seats and airlines ready to fly to that airport, and the fact that there was a subsidy which was being given. In many cases, of course, the subsidy was never even used, but the fact that there is a subsidy available for each seat which is there for some of the smaller cities ensured that there is an affordability as far as flying is concerned. So the per capita income, as we say in India, we are a 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion country, and if the middle class is almost 60 to 70 crores or 600 to 700 million people, each of them have got the propensity to fly at least once or twice a year, looking at the airfares today. And if you are talking about 700 million people ready to fly, and that is the target available, and today the number of passengers who are flying are only about 170 or 180 million, you can see the kind of potential that is available to grow as far as the aviation sector in India is concerned. So I think the UDAN scheme, I think, is very much in the right direction. It is an excellent scheme, and I do hope that it is continued till the time the travel becomes normalized in a way that you don't need it.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone? One more question from audience side before we run out of time.
Have more questions in the Q&A? That's it.
One more question. One more question. You don't have?
No, so we don't have. I've
Confirm.
only got 2 questions.
Okay.
There's
Then,
one
let me
question,
ask.
Moses, if I may ask, sorry.
Please.
I think as we look into the future, there is also this these ports called drone ports coming up, or at least the idea of drone ports coming up globally. It's not just in one particular country or region. It's been thought over all across. So is there any reflection, or I mean, from the panelists, of course, what approach should we be taking? Would that approach be very different to what infrastructure that we've been building or developing traditionally over the years? And the reason why I asked that also is because these drone ports probably are going to be, or at least that's the idea, is going to be part of the urban landscape. So it's not the usual airport, which is 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers away from the city or somewhere outside. So I don't know what infrastructure limitations or what infrastructure would mean really there when it comes to a drone port. So I don't know if you had any chance to look at some of these examples that are coming up, or is there anything that that you would like to reflect, whether it's on the financial side or just the infrastructure, existing infrastructure availability, and more importantly, what does that really mean when we start setting up these kind of drone ports in urban landscape? Moses, over to you.
Mr. Konstantinos, can you reflect on that thing?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, it's not within my areas of expertise. I've seen two studies. I've seen 2 studies that are very contradictory to each other. I mean, the one sees it as complementary to aviation and actually facilitating its further growth, and also acting as high-speed rail, enhancing the catchment areas. But on the other hand, I've also seen it as a competitive mode to air transportation. So, I mean, that was only 2 studies that I have seen, so I don't have the required experience to answer this question. But it's very exciting. I'm looking very forward how the future will.
Siddharth Kapoor sir, can you reflect on it in the light of India's drone policy as well as the latest developments in the sector? So
I think it's a very important issue as far as development of the aviation infrastructure is concerned. Drone ports or veriports, as we call them. I think number of international players have taken initiatives. I know for a fact that Vinci has a separate team looking at veriports, and looking at the fact that I think it is also very much synergistic with helicopters. So effectively, one will need to see that how this can complement, because I don't see, looking at the technology available for very many years, that passenger drones or helicopters are going to become competitors to long distance air travel. It will only probably complement it. And I think that's where the government needs to think that how to integrate the veriports into the regular, airport infrastructure. One is the availability of infrastructure, land, and putting up the infrastructure, which is, I think, much more simpler issue, because it does not require, a significant amount of, land. But I think the more critical issue is the airspace management. And in India, we have a number of areas where this needs to be addressed. For example, in Delhi, the airspace management is a complex affair between the airport, the VIP airspace, and now the airspace coming up for, 2 other airports in the region. So, all this is a very complex thing to handle. And then management of how the things will, how a drone will move, how a helicopter will move as far as airspace is concerned. I think there needs to be a cohesive thought given to it. And that's where I think the government needs to give it a thought on airspace management and see how it can be integrated and complemented to the existing airport infrastructure.
Yeah, connected to that, in extension of that only, what do you think about Hyperloop? How it will affect airports? For example, whether the Hyperloop will have a what kind of impact on the short haul flights, short haul airports, also near neighboring airports and all those things. How it will impact the airport sector, Hyperloop?
So, I mean, Hyperloop is a mass transit, high-speed mass transit, and if Hyperloop is successful on I would say medium-term distances, let's say from Bombay to Pune, I think it can definitely not just impact the air travel from Bombay to Pune, but also impact the regular rail travel and the regular travel which happens by road. So it is definitely a major disruptor, and but it's going to be extremely expensive. Now we have to see how economical it can be for a passenger to travel and what will be the cost of travel. So those are, I think, some of the critical issues. But theoretically, if you look at it, if there is a high-speed rail, now for example, you have a high-speed rail coming up between Ahmedabad and Mumbai, definitely it is going to impact your air travel in that city. It has impacted air travel in Europe. In fact, air travel in Europe is now being pushed. You have this flight shaming where people are being pushed to use rail more than air on account of environment reasons. But I think in this case, India being a vast country, I think there is still a huge scope for growth in aviation, and whatever little the government does on high speed, mass rail transit, whether it is Hyperloop or it is a high speed rail, I think it is going to be really some time before it becomes affordable on a mass scale on a long term basis. But definitely wherever it is going to come, it's going to impact it.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Sagar?
We can hear you. Yeah, we cannot see
Yeah,
you.
yeah. As there is no questions, more questions.
Actually, there are 2 more questions. Maybe if there are quick remarks, probably maybe Anaga, you can go ahead with the question for Konstantinos that we have received. The question is, has Cyprus experimented with SNI ops? Hello? Konstantinos, are you still there?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question received is, has Cyprus experimented with SNI ops? So,
to be honest, I haven't been. I mean, the only projects I've been involved in Cyprus was the ORAT for Larnaca and the certification of both aerodromes. So I haven't been actively on following the situation.
The other question, yeah, I think the other question is for both of you. Actually, maybe you can give a European perspective. But considering the present difficulties in land acquisition rules, there are possibilities to use water resources to land aircrafts, or so is there a of course, we have spoken about Hyperloop, which is on the land, but it's a good question to also reflect, because we also have this discussion around like, why are we not using our inland waterways or generally the waterway connections? So how would you see that as we build our infrastructure? So Konstantin, you can go ahead first, and then Siddharth, sir.
Yes, actually, I can tell you the example of Greece, because of Greece has more than 1,000 islands, and there have been 2 companies currently that they are trying to start seaports and also with seaplane operations. So there are different views again. I mean, one issue we had for a couple of years, seaplane connections in the Ionian Sea, and there have been 2 companies more than a decade now trying to certify seaports and get seaplanes in Greece. There are challenges. I mean, there are the challenges regarding the weather, because also, you know, in Greece it gets quite wavy, the sea in the Aegean. So if you look at in terms of the geographical area of Greece, it seems that the Ionian islands, the Ionian Sea, it's more appropriate. And they have looked at in terms of cost, and what happens. There is definitely a gap in the market for the small islands, but it is questionable whether seaplanes will be a good alternative at the islands that have reasonable airports and have quite good connection to Athens or Thessaloniki.
Thank you, Konstantinos. So that, sir, you have anything to reflect? Because we also are surrounded, or we have enough water resources across the country.
Yeah, no, I think
Even connecting.
the potential is huge. It is definitely available to be tapped. The government already has initiatives on development of seaplane and use of water resources for both water transportation as well as for air transportation. I know for a fact SpiceJet has been having certain flights in different areas as far as seaplanes are concerned. It is being used very, very effectively in Maldives for connection between different islands. And given our water resources and the wide dispersal, I think it's an opportunity waiting to be tapped. But again, I think the fact is that it is more a short haul opportunity. You cannot use seaplanes on a a long haul or a medium haul basis. For example, I don't know now whether Delhi has the Yamuna has enough water for a seaplane to land, or the Mumbai Sea is available throughout the year for a seaplane to land. But given the fact that there are a number of other cities in the country, in UP, in Madhya Pradesh, in southern India, where you have perennial rivers, I think it's an opportunity waiting to be tapped. And I think, I mean, I always say that India is an infrastructure deficit country. And these are I think, the plug-in gaps which will come in as and when the opportunities get thrown up. And a lot will depend on the business model and the robustness of the business model when we look at an individual connection. We have seen, as I mentioned earlier, we have seen railway trains being privatized, but not successful because of the maybe a little more work to be done on the business model. So I think what is more critical is to see that how that concession or a framework is robust enough, what the government is giving and what the private sector player is looking at in terms of the business model, to see that the success of that particular initiative is in place. And I think, but it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, I think we have discussed quite a lot about the policy as well as economic aspects of it, and what is in the pipeline in the light of COVID situation. I think in the near future, we are expecting the traffic to be back and the infrastructure will be, required infrastructure will be available, and long-term planning is required for developing infrastructure. That's the main takes for both which is coming out of this discussion. And I think I should thank the panelists, Constantinos and Siddharth Kapoor, for giving their valuable time and answering all the questions. And anything else, Sagar? And
Thank you.
also for giving the opportunity. So
I should be thanking.
Over to Sagar.
Yeah, thank you, Moses. Thanks to each of you for being part of the conference and also for sharing your insight. I would only probably end with one question, but for a very quick remark from the panelists, like for 2020, because the theme of our conference is the fall or rise of the transport sector. And of course, as Moses pointed out in the beginning, infrastructure is the backbone for the transport sector. For if at all, if you have a wish for 2022 or in general for the transport infrastructure sector, what would it be? And it could be to the government, it could be to the private sector, but if there's anything, a very quick remark would be helpful. Or you could say, hey, this is all going to fall as well if we don't put something in place. So Konstantinos, maybe first you, and then to Siddharth sir, and then last to Moses, maybe.
Yes, well, quite optimistic regarding the recovery. I mean, despite the Omicron variant, so I think the recovery rates for the aviation sector will be higher than 2021. I think we'll definitely need a couple of more years to reach the 2019 levels. So as traffic returns, I'm quite positive also that investors will return in terms of airport infrastructure, because as the previous panel you have discussed, the airline industry is is the industry with the lowest profit margins, but this is not the case with airports, that the profit margins are quite reasonable, and also it's a steady business. So I can see definitely the rise of the aviation sector. I mean, to be more precise, the partial rise of the aviation sector in 2022 and hopefully full rise 2023.
Siddharth Kapoor, sir.
Yeah, no, I think I am also optimistic. It's a rise and it's not a fall. I think what it has fallen has been significant, and it's transport is a very critical enabler of not just business but for the entire population, and I think it's a very basic need now, and there is definitely going to be a rise. I think there are 2 or 3 things which are very critical. One is that there can be revenge travel, there can be sudden spurt post-COVID, post-vaccination. People are more confident to travel, so suddenly there can be a big spurt coming in, which can kind of give the impression that there is going to be a sudden boom, but it may kind of settle down a little bit and then rise in accordance with its regular organic growth which is going to come. So that's why I think the real trigger for normalized growth, I think, is I would say 2023. 2022 can be sudden spurt, and then probably a more rationalization of the the growth which is coming in. But I think this has given a significant opportunity for various players to look at technology, innovation, and also the government to see what they can do in terms of aviation sector. And government has also realized it needs to be an enabler and creates a conducive regulatory framework for this sector. So all this, I think, is auguring well for the the aviation sector, and I'm quite optimistic about it, that not just the air travel will improve, but also I think the initiatives by various airport operators and airline operators will significantly play a positive role in their business model. The initiative they have taken as part of COVID will be more long-term and sustained, and I think that will help their business model in the long run.
Yeah, thank you. The panelists are also very optimistic for the rise of the sector, and they're hopeful that the traffic will come back. And I'm sure that this will be a time for better planning and responding positively to the situations, as well as taking all the stakeholders' views and planning and going ahead with the future development of infrastructure. Thank you, panelists, Dr. Konstantinos and Siddharth Kapoor, as well as organizers, and Mr. Sagar. Thanks a lot. Anything? Over to Sagar.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. And
thank you.
We'll have a break now, and the next session starts at 2 o'clock on the urban transport and the urban transport panel. Yeah. Okay. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.